South Korea is doing something that could dismantle Putin's power projection across Eastern Europe and collapse the Ukrainian front. And it's doing this without sending a single soldier, without firing a single bullet. Now, Moscow has to confront a reality it has ignored for years. This is something beyond Russia's capacity to handle. Putin played a risky gamble, taking soldiers and ammunition from North Korea to keep his depleting army alive on the Ukrainian front. In return, he gave them a nuclear submarine reactor, a drone production line, and missile guidance systems. But this gamble brought him face to face with an adversary he cannot even retaliate against. Because for South Korea, this was a direct existential threat, a red line. And Putin knowingly crossed it. Now he has to face the consequences because South Korea is making its move. And for Russia, it means a genuine catastrophe. On May 12th, 2026, South Korea held its second defense consultative meeting with NATO and launched STANAG negotiations, gaining access to NATO weapons standards. In February, Hanwha Aerospace broke ground on its first European production center in Romania. South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs officially announced that all contacts with NATO regarding military support for Ukraine are ongoing, and Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zakharova's statement within 48 hours. We will be forced to exercise our right to asymmetric retaliation is the clearest admission of the shock this move caused in the Kremlin. Asymmetric retaliation. Why asymmetric? Because Putin has to think 10 times before mounting a symmetric response against South Korea. Maybe he has the power, but what he'd lose far outweighs what he'd gain, and you'll see exactly why very shortly. To grasp the magnitude of this move, we need to unpack what happened on May 12th. Most people dismissed it as just another meeting. It wasn't. STANAG NATO standardization agreements, over 1,200 technical standards that enable NATO armies to use each other's ammunition, connect communication systems, and operate weapons platforms together. If a German soldier can use American ammunition in Poland, it's thanks to STANAG. South Korea wants access to these standards, and this changes everything. Until now, South Korea sold weapons to NATO countries through bilateral agreements, country by country, contract by contract. STANAG access fundamentally transforms this. South Korean weapons begin to be manufactured to NATO standards. Ammunition becomes compatible with NATO inventories. Communication systems integrate with NATO command structures. South Korea is no longer an outside arms seller to NATO. It's becoming a production power embedded inside NATO's defense machine. This is a merging of forces between South Korea and NATO, and Hanwha's factory in Romania completes this picture. Weapons are no longer shipped from Asia. They're being produced on NATO soil inside Europe. Localization rate targets 80% with over 30 Romanian companies. This isn't an arms sale. It's industrial fusion and irreversible integration. Think about this from Putin's perspective. Blocking South Korean weapons was already difficult. But with STANAG access and domestic European production, South Korean weapons are becoming NATO's own weapons. Breaking this chain now means breaking NATO's own supply line. For Putin, this isn't a temporary crisis. It's a permanent structural transformation, and the numbers back this up. South Korea is the second largest arms exporter to NATO members. Its 2026 export target is $37 billion. A special defense industry envoy is touring Europe for $56.2 billion in deals. The 2030 goal becoming the world's fourth largest arms exporter. South Korea is the one country that can give Poland, Romania, Norway, and Finland the capacity to defend themselves against Putin. And now that capacity is being embedded into NATO's industrial backbone. At the same time, South Korea is joining forces with Ukraine. Through the POWERLESS mechanism, Seoul can finance the Ukrainian military without sending a single bullet, channeling funds that become Patriot missiles, air defense systems, and precision munitions. 75% of Patriot missiles and 90% of other air defense missiles delivered to Ukraine have been funded through POWERLESS. And Japan is about to join the same mechanism, a dual front move from the Pacific. So why is South Korea abandoning the neutrality it maintained for decades? Why not in 2022 or 2023, but in late 2025 and 2026? Because when Putin launched the war in 2022 for South Korea, it was still a distant conflict in Europe. Seoul kept its distance, sent humanitarian aid, issued condemnations, but didn't engage militarily. As long as the North Korea relationship remained at a commercial level, South Korea could tolerate it. The breaking point came in late 2024 when Putin began taking soldiers from North Korea. Over 20,000 North Korean soldiers were sent to Russia. 6,000 were killed or wounded. But what truly galvanized South Korea wasn't the casualty figures. It was what Putin gave in return. A nuclear submarine reactor means North Korea can launch ballistic missiles from submarines. Second strike capability, covert nuclear attack capacity, hidden from satellite surveillance. A drone production line means North Korea learning modern warfare tactics. Precision missile guidance means ballistic missiles targeting South Korean cities can now hit within 50 meters. And one more detail. According to a Reuters investigation, North Korea now supplies more than half of all artillery shells Russia uses in Ukraine. In April 2025, a North Korean KN-23 ballistic missile struck Kiev, killing 13 civilians. For South Korea, this is no longer a war in Europe. It's a war in which weapons launched from its own peninsula are killing people. Putin traded his most critical Asian bridge for a few million low-quality shells. And South Korea's indirect supply chain was already running. A $12 billion deal with Poland put K-2 tanks and K-9 howitzers in Europe, while Poland sent its Soviet-era weapons to Ukraine. Everyone won except Russia. Pearl participation is making this indirect chain institutional and permanent. Now let's get to why Putin appears strong but has his hands tied, and this deadlock is hidden where most people wouldn't expect. Let's go down to the production lines of Russia's defense industry. To manufacture a modern tank, guided missile, or drone, you need CNC machines, high-precision metalworking equipment. Before the war, Russia imported 70 to 90% of these from abroad. Despite sanctions, some still reach Russian factories through gray channels from South Korea. Stop and think about this. Russia needs the technology of a country it has declared an enemy to run its war machine. If South Korea shuts down these channels, tank engines can't be machined. Missile bodies can't be manufactured. This isn't an ordinary trade restriction. It's the direct strangulation of Russia's capacity to produce weapons at the front. And it's not limited to heavy machinery. Inside Russia's Orlan-10 reconnaissance drones and Shahed UAVs are hybrid couplers and communication modules manufactured by South Korean firms. Samsung and SK are giants of the global semiconductor chain. Seoul's embargo means blinding the Russian military's electronic eyes. Do you see the irony? More than half the shells from North Korea can't fire, but the precision components of the guns firing those shells come from South Korea. Russia is making its own weapons with its enemy's technology, and that enemy is now getting ready to turn off the tap. Putin has known about this dependency since 2022, but he couldn't cut it because pressuring South Korea meant shutting down his own production lines. That's why he stretched the relationship for 4 years without breaking it. And now South Korea is turning off the tap on its own initiative. Putin's worst-case scenario. Putin has an energy card. We know this. Russia exports natural gas and oil to South Korea. Theoretically, he could shut off these taps. But why hasn't he done it since 2022? Because playing the energy card would hurt Putin more than South Korea. If South Korea loses its energy supply, it cuts deals with the US, Qatar, Australia. Alternatives exist. The transition would be painful, but the South Korean economy is strong enough to absorb it. But if Putin loses South Korea, what happens? CNC machines stop. Semiconductor flow cuts off. LNG tankers go without maintenance. Arctic energy exports collapse. The cost of playing the energy card is heavier than the card itself. And there's more. South Korea has the world's largest shipyard capacity, over 40% of global orders. Russia's Arctic LNG projects depend on these shipyards. Ships on the northern sea route are built and maintained in South Korea. If Putin plays the energy card, Seoul plays the shipyard card, and Russia's polar energy exports stop. Putin has an energy weapon, but South Korean shipyards manufacture that weapon's barrel. This is a chess game, and every move Putin makes weakens his own position. Cut energy, lose technology in shipyards, arm North Korea, further motivate South Korea, threaten militarily, face the US, apply diplomatic pressure, but there's no door left to close. He looks strong, but his hands are tied, and he tied them himself. Military threat. There are 28,500 U.S. troops in South Korea. THAAD is deployed, the world's 5th largest army. A military threat means war with the U.S. Putin can't afford that while losing 1,000 soldiers a day in Ukraine. Arming North Korea further. Putin is already doing that. In April 2026, Russian Defense Minister Belousov personally traveled to Pyongyang to pledge deeper cooperation. But the more Russia arms North Korea, the more it motivates South Korea to support Ukraine. The North Korea card doesn't break, it accelerates. Consider the asymmetry at the front. A significant portion of North Korean shells can't fire, can't detonate, or miss their targets. Facing them is one of the world's largest 155mm shell manufacturers, with industrial capacity that can multiply production lines on demand. K-9 howitzers make precision strikes while moving. K-2 tanks have active protection and fire on the move capability against Russia's T-90 series. A Ukrainian trench equipped with South Korean technology becomes a death trap difficult for Russian assault groups to overcome. And South Korea is learning from Ukraine, too. South Korea's Army Chief of Staff announced in April 2026, 50,000 drones by 2029, a personal drone for every soldier. Lessons from Ukraine being applied directly. As South Korea finances American weapons, other NATO countries can concentrate budgets on HIMARS ammunition. Don't underestimate the psychological weight on Russian soldiers. Troops motivated by the West will abandon Ukraine propaganda, now see a massive Asian arsenal opening against them. The Kremlin's attrition plans are being shaken to their foundations. But let's be honest, South Korea's hand isn't as free as it appears either. In June 2025, a political earthquake hit after President Yoon's martial law and impeachment. Leftist Lee Jae-young won the election. Lee had openly criticized sending lethal weapons to Ukraine during his campaign. He pursues dialogue with North Korea. He even had border propaganda speakers dismantled. But here's the most striking tension. Even a leftist president can't stop this train. The Lee government continues POWERLESS negotiations with NATO. Lee personally spoke with NATO Secretary General Rutter. Defense budget increased by 8.2%. The first civilian defense minister since 1961 was appointed. Why? Because the threat is bigger than ideology. The city mock-ups at Cox and submarine reactors from Vladivostok. Casualty data from the front. These are realities no party affiliation can ignore. But direct lethal weapons transfer remains a step not yet taken. The Lee government stands at this threshold. Second question mark, China. South Korea's largest trading partner. In 2016, China declared open economic war over THAAD, forced latte stores closed, restricted tourism, launched boycotts. It could play the same card again. But China is also stuck. North Korea's drift toward Russia weakens Beijing's influence. If it pressures, it pushes North Korea even further toward Russia. China's silence isn't approval, it's calculation, and the war's quiet dimension. Russian citizens fleeing conscription have been seeking refuge in South Korea for 3 years. As Russia's brightest minds leave, Putin keeps creating new adversaries. This isn't an ordinary diplomatic exchange. It's the collapse of 30 years of massive geopolitical effort. After the Soviet fall, a genuine golden age was built with South Korea. Visa-free travel, Hyundai and Samsung dominating the Russian market, billions in energy and technology investments. Moscow met its Asian technology needs through Seoul. Those bridges were destroyed in exchange for a few thousand North Korean soldiers and low-caliber ammunition. The ripple effect extends beyond South Korea. Japan made a radical defense shift. Australia is increasing its military budget. The aggressive policies of the Russia-China axis are generating an unprecedented Asia-NATO integration. Even Iran, which supplies suicide drones to Moscow, is affected. Illegal part supply chains are being tightened. Putin's North Korea gamble is narrowing not just the Korean peninsula balance, but the entire authoritarian axis's room to maneuver. The Kremlin may have gained a few weeks on the battlefield, but in return, it made one of the world's largest and fastest producing defense industrial powers a permanent, institutional, and angry adversary. Putin's long war strategy collapses right here. He hoped the West would grow weary. But while NATO stockpiles empty, new systems rolling off Seoul's production lines keep the Ukrainian army breathing. Time is working against Russia. Putin's South Korea problem actually summarizes his entire Ukraine war, accepting long-term destruction for short-term gains, taking 10 strategic steps backward to advance one step at the front, losing 10 allies to gain one. We saw the same thing when Finland and Sweden joined NATO. We saw it when European defense spending exploded. We saw it when the Shadow Fleet began being hunted in the Baltic. And now we're seeing it once again as South Korea opens its weapons door to Ukraine. Every move Putin makes accelerates what he's trying to stop. Every threat strengthens the front against him. The real question is when Seoul will transition to direct lethal weapons transfer. When that day comes, every rusty shell and every fake ID soldier from North Korea will become meaningless because facing them will be a continental-scale industrial power. Putin knowingly crossed that line. One of history's most expensive strategic mistakes. The bill is still being paid. The red lines have been drawn. If you found this content interesting, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.